Things are getting crazy for the Toronto Maple Leafs as a recent report has come out indicating that a big trade is imminent and that they could also be looking to sign a very interesting player. So I'm going to break down that report, discuss what it entails, and how it impacts the Toronto Maple Leafs going forward into the rest of the offseason. Because Brad Living said yesterday that moves are coming, and these moves might be surprising. Stay tuned for all that in this episode. But before we do, if you're a part of the 70 or so percent who aren't subscribed to the channel, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It would mean the world to Darius and myself as we're on the road to 12,000 subscribers, and we'll have you covered with all the latest news. Because simply, the Leafs news is getting hotter and hotter each day, and the regular season is approaching very, very fast. But Darius, let's just dive right into it. This is going to be an interesting one today. So a report came out, and take this with a grain of salt. However, he has gotten things right in the past, and it's a very interesting discussion point, especially with Brad Treliving yesterday, basically indicating that moves are going to be coming. And we kind of hinted at the fact that we think it's going to be a Nick Robertson trade. And then this drops yesterday from Havoc Andrew. Now, again, if you're unfamiliar with him, he's gotten some things right in the past in the Leafs land. He got some things right in Jays land. So he has some sources within Toronto sports, but again, take it with a grain of salt. It's not Elliot Friedman, but this gained a lot of traction, so we had to cover it. It says nothing certain, but the Leafs might sign Matt Martin and Cal Clutterbuck. Matt Martin on a PTO. And there's something very interesting here, which we'll get into in a minute, but let's just start with these players first, Darius. And you look at a couple of the guys, like Cal Clutterbuck, you look at Martin. We can dive into both and dissect both here, but what are your thoughts on this report? And again, there's another piece of this report regarding a trade, which we'll get into in a second, but what are your initial thoughts on this before we dive deeper?
So very, very interesting, right? I'm looking at Clutterbuck and I'm very intrigued with that player, even though he's older than Martin and he's getting older. He's 36, right? And he's not getting much younger. So obviously, that would be kind of risky. Same with Matt Martin. I mean, he's been on the Leafs and he was kind of, Mitch Marner's buddy. We remember that from his rookie year. And he put Marner and a couple of guys in their happy place. So that could be something that they're looking at, right? Maybe, just that factor. Because when you look at their stats, I mean, their stats don't jump off the table at you, right? Because they're not supposed to. That's not the type of players that they are. They're here to kind of bang and smash, and they're playoff type players. But Cal Clutterbuck has been a very interesting playoff performer for the Islanders the last couple of years. So I think that, I'm kind of leaning more towards Clutterbuck, the idea of getting him as the Leafs, more so than Matt Martin. I think Martin, I don't know. I don't know if he has that much upside anymore. And I think it would be kind of weird to have Matt Martin and Ryan Reeves on the same team. So something has to give in that way. And for both, maybe they're not going to sign both of them. Maybe Matt Martin on a PTO, like said in the tweet. But I think it's just kind of puzzling with the current makeup of the team, which means that a trade could be coming, right? But I'm kind of skeptical about that as well, because I don't think you should trade pretty, decently valued pieces for, to be able to sign guys who are 36 and going to play on your fourth line. They're going to be great and they're going to give you an identity for sure. They're going to be great in the playoffs, but I don't know if you should sacrifice some of the names we're going to talk about in favor of, Matt Martin, bringing him back, or Kyle Clutterbuck. Although I do like Clutterbuck. I think he would be a very useful piece for the Leafs, and I would like to see him with the Leafs because he's not going to play every game. He'd probably come in on a lower end contract, right? Probably league min or something like that, maybe 1 year. So I would be interested in that. Don't understand the Matt Martin thing at this point in time. And Ryan Reeves, something has to give in that way too.
Yeah, and Clutterbuck played 82 games last year for the Islanders. He still has, at 36, something left in the tank. And you mentioned the whole, the fit is very interesting at this point. I don't know if when Brad Living is talking about moves, he's talking about maybe having something like this in the pipeline, whether it's a PTO, a Cal Clutterbuck, Matt Martin. But this is what the second part of the tweet was. He said there will be a trade coming. Could be Robertson and Järnkrok and David Kampf traded. So again, take it with a grain of salt, but he's gotten a lot of things right in the past. And I tend to believe that something like this is going to happen. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist and another shopping Nick Robertson, but it makes sense for Järnkrok and David Kampf as well. However, this is, again, in response to this tweet. So if they're getting rid of, let's say, Robertson and Järnkrok, obviously they're going to get a return for Robertson, but maybe they want to replace Robertson with a more veteran type player, and then maybe they're going to, depending what they get back from Nick Robertson, whether it's a defenseman, I feel like at this point it should be, we don't really know what the return for Robertson could. It could be a prospect, it could be an NHL ready forward, it could be an NHL ready defenseman. We've obviously seen a lot of different talks about what the trade could be, but looking at this, a trade could be coming. That's three players that would frequent the Leafs lineup every single day last season, almost on a gamely basis, aside from Robertson a little bit. Kampf, Järnkrok, and Nick Robertson could be headed out in exchange for obviously what you get from those trades. But I'm hoping they don't just replace Robertson with Cal Clutterbuck, even though it's obviously not going to happen. But it depends on what return they can get from Robertson. And Robertson doesn't have the leverage, but he did request a trade, so it's going to be interesting to see what kind of value he's holding at this point.
Yeah, we don't know the blueprint of exactly what Brad Living wants to do in a way of that. Like Nick Robertson out, Clutterbuck in, doesn't really make sense in that way, right? But one thing that I think is going to be interesting to watch with the Leafs is I'm going to call them floaters. I think the Leafs have too many floaters right now, which is a couple of guys like Robertson, Yarncroke, who float around the lineup and don't really have a defined role. I feel like the Leafs have to start getting away from that. Kerfoot was another one that I feel like was a floater. He kind of floated around the lineup. I think you need more guys who are more defined in their roles and who have an identity and can bring an identity to a certain line because a lot of teams that win the Stanley Cup have that, and I feel like the Leafs have not had that for a very long time. So I think that they need to, David Camp, I think he's a very effective player at what he does, but he makes too much. So he might be a casualty of that as well, right? So I think they're looking at all the options, including all of those names. Definitely could see all of them in play. And like I said, I think the Leafs need less floaters. Now, if you look at a guy like Max Domi, who kind of floats around the lineup too, I feel like he has a more defined role. But when there's injuries, he can take on different roles. I feel like that's different. I feel like Yarncroke sometimes he's the Swiss Army knife they keep talking about, right? But that might not be a good thing. He's kind of floating around the lineup. He doesn't have a defined role, and they kind of just plug guys in where they can. And I feel like that could be detrimental to the Leafs lineup. So, if you bring in a guy like Cal Clutterbuck, you know what he brings. He's going to play on your fourth line, couple games here and there, whatever, right? I don't think he'd play all 82 games, but anything can happen, right? So I like that, but I wonder what they get back in a trade for, Robertson or Yarncroke or even Camp, because Camp makes a lot of money for what he does. And I don't think a lot of teams are going to be interested in that. So that's what I feel about that. Could be interesting. I do think that there's a trade coming because if you look at the blueprint of the team right now, not much is adding up and making sense. I don't think they can go into the season with what they have right now. They certainly can't because Robertson's not signed. So obviously something's going to happen and quickly. Training camp's only 3 weeks, 4 weeks away. So it's coming quick.
Yeah, it's a month away, and obviously what happens with Nick Robertson is going to be the big factor here about what happens with these two players as well. Not super high on Martin. I'm same with you in this case. I mean, Clutterbuck would be an interesting fit, but again, you mentioned the floater thing. Yarncroc, David Kampf, you mentioned Alex Kerfoot, like all these guys, they're decent. We saw them last year. They're not going to change a game for you. But at the same time, you look at the Leafs blue line, they are all pretty solid with set roles. You look at the Leafs forwards this season, upcoming season that is, it's a little bit scary because you don't know. You could get a great season out of Nick Robertson. You could get a decent season out of David Kampf. But at the same time, you could have a disastrous season out of David Kampf where he's getting paid. We think he's not getting paid, or he's getting paid too much now. He could end up getting paid even, the contract could look way worse if he had a really bad season last year or next year. Sorry. Like, there's a lot of just not weird players. Just, I don't know how it's going to fit next season. And that's why I think Brad Living is looking for a trade from Nick Robertson. Obviously, Robertson requested it, but David Kampf, especially Cal Yarncroke, to get some players that we know what they're going to bring a bit more. I think I agree with you with the floater thing. There's a big delta between really good and really bad, and that could be devastating for a Leafs team that needs to win over the next 2 years. And maybe that's why they're looking to bring in a guy like Cal Clutterbuck, which again, he has a lower ceiling than some of the other guys we're talking about, but at least we know that he's going to be a decent, a functioning player that's going to be a very solid piece to the team. It could fit in with the Leafs pretty well. That being said, if they trade Nick Robertson and all these guys, they need to get back NHL ready players because Nick Robertson, he is a floater, but at least I think if you give him 82 games, he'd still put up 50 points with 20 to 25 goals. I think that's realistic. But the other guys, David Kampf, Cal Yarncroc, it worries me a little bit to see what could happen if they tail off next season, especially given the fact that the money they're making, specifically Kampf.
Yeah, and they might, right? And that's the real scary part. And in terms of Nick Robertson, like you mentioned too, like if in a perfect world, if he had a contract and he was kind of forced to play, even though he wanted to trade, like a Jake DeBrusk type thing with the Bruins, where he requested a trade and they never granted it. When he coming into the lineup, right? He's an NHL player. Like if he was to play this year with a contract and all that was all fine and dandy, right? So if you're going to trade him, you're going to get back a second round pick or something. A second round pick can't play in your lineup, right? You're going to have to get something that plays in your lineup and hopefully is effective. But the thing is, there's no real leverage there, whether you're the Leafs or Robertson in a trade, right? So I just don't know if that's going to happen. I feel like the best case scenario for both parties is sign a contract and get to playing, right? Because, if Robertson doesn't sign by December, I think the deadline was, we saw with Nylander, he's going to lose the season, and that could be detrimental to him and the Leafs, right? You get nothing in return for him. You lose a season out of him, and maybe, he's not progressing in the NHL like he should, and he's getting older, right? So hopefully, a contract is signed. Even if they sign a contract, he could still get traded. It might make him more appealing to other teams as well, like we were talking about with Liljegren. So it's going to be interesting to watch. I think if you do trade him, though, like you mentioned, you need an NHL player back.
Yeah, and that's going to be the big question mark is over the next month or so what they do with Nick Robertson. It seems like a trade is going to be coming, so let us know in the comments. Out of these two players, I think most people would agree. I mean, Clutterbuck's an interesting one. Martin can be interesting, but not with the current landscape of the team. But I also have a feeling some of you down there might be saying the Leafs need to swing for some bigger, go fishing for some bigger players and some bigger fish in the market. But let us know in the comments what your thoughts are on that, and we'll see you guys tomorrow.